Hi everyone, and welcome to the Green New Deal for Public Housing Teach-In. We're going to be letting folks filter in for the next couple of minutes. And so while we wait for that, we invite you to go to bit.ly/sunboss to sign in if you haven't done so already. And when you're done with that, you can use the chat function to type your name, why you're interested in this workshop, and then something cool or funny or pretty you see looking outside your window right now. I'm gonna pop up the chat so we can start seeing what's coming in. I'll share what I see going on outside my window. It looks really windy and there's this flag that's my neighbor's and it's blowing all sorts of crazy right now.
Yeah, and thank you all for joining us over Zoom. Yeah, it's crazy times out there. Yeah, there's some cool stuff outside my window. I'm really into, there's a house outside that's like a very pale yellow. That's like really beautiful, so.
Great to see some responses coming in. People excited to learn about the public housing, Green New Deal. Ooh, and there's a mysterious house that has lights on once a year. I'm intrigued.
Yeah, an abandoned bike. Both of those are kind of haunted. That's interesting.
Yes, let's get excited about green infrastructure and housing affordability. I'm on board with that. A bird that flew by.
Oh, that's lovely.
Leaves popping out on the trees. Yeah, that's got me excited. Great, we'll give it just another minute, I think, and then we'll jump into introductions and get started.
Everyone is seeing such like idyllic scenes outside. Some small mountains over the trees. It's like very pastoral.
The weird upsides of being homebound. We're all noticing things in our yards or neighborhoods that see every day, and then all of a sudden can really focus in on. Great to see your reasons for wanting to join this panel right now. I echo the sentiment about the sun on the porch. Love seeing the sun. All right, so it's 3:05, so we're gonna get started with introductions now. So first, we'd just like to introduce ourselves. These are photos of we're gonna have 3 presenters today. Myself is one, my name is Gwen.
I can introduce myself. I'm Saritha, and we have a third panelist who will be joining us a little later. Her name is Adrienne, and we have chosen to feature ourselves with the animals that have been in our lives. Unfortunately, this dog Oliver, who's my roommate, does not like to be held. Otherwise, I could have, repeated the pattern.
Great. So while people are filtering in, today is a really exciting day. Today marks the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And while it may not be the day that we all planned on a few months ago as we were preparing for Earth Day, it's still exciting. And so we invite you to take a picture, tag yourself in some of these fun hashtags, upload it to social media platform of your choice. Also a reminder, this is the Green New Deal for Public Housing Training. And today is a 9-hour live stream through Sunrise Boston. And up after this segment will be the history of strikes and the labor movement, at 5 o'clock. And then that'll be followed by the rally with Senator Ed Markey at 7 o'clock. So we hope to see you tuned in for all of these. And another plug for ways to get involved with Sunrise, a new opportunity that has recently started is Sunrise School. And so this is a really great way to build connections and take action while social distancing. So we invite you to check that out. And then finally, just a note on interruptions. We want everyone to know that we do have moderators on this call. So in the case that we do get interrupted by ill-willed individuals, please just turn down your volume, avoid looking at the chat, and the presentation will eventually resume once we get them bounced out. All right, so also this is a webinar, and so we can't see your faces, unfortunately, but we still want to hear your thoughts and questions. And so we invite you to use the chat function to engage, and you can do this by just adding a plus sign if you agree with something that's been said. And then also if you have questions, there is this Q&A panel that you'll see at the bottom toolbar on your screen. And so type your questions into there, and we'll be trying to answer those as we go at the end of each section. So quickly, we're just going to take a look at the agenda. Today's workshop hopes to share with you coverage of the housing in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. And then we're also just going to take a look at public housing history in the US. We hope that by the end of this, you'll be able to share main facets of the Green New Deal for public housing, and then begin to take action starting today to support this bill. This also has just a quick overview of the schedule so you can know what to expect. After our introductions here, we're going to jump into the state of COVID-19 with regards to housing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about why the Green New Deal for public housing is a priority of ours right now. We will follow that up with a quick action for everyone to take from their own homes. And the second half of this presentation will cover the history of public housing in the US. We'll discuss in further depth the Green New Deal for public housing, the 3 pillars there. And then we'll have our plan for how we're going to win this thing, and wrap up with a national housing action for everyone also to take at home. All right. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Sarita, who will head off our presentation.
Great, thank you, Gwen, for all the introduction. This presentation obviously is focused on the Green New Deal for public housing as a seminal piece of legislation and the first piece of Green New Deal legislation. However, because it is focused on housing, we would be really remiss if we didn't talk about housing in the context of the pandemic and sort of how this bill fits into that larger context. So that's what we're going to do right now. So I want you guys to think about, what the world was like prior to the pandemic. Maybe it's January, maybe it's February. And I think what's important to know is to understand the context of what the housing crisis was even before this pandemic. So here are some headlines to demonstrate that. The United States is facing an affordable housing crisis. The affordable housing crisis is about to get worse. Rents are growing much faster than wages. So we really see, even before the pandemic, because these headlines are all from before, that we're really facing a crisis of a shortage of affordable housing units, and the sort of longer term issue of the fact that wages are not really growing as quickly or increasing as quickly as rents are, essentially. So that's a fundamental problem, right? Because then people are spending more and more of their income on housing, which for people who are in really precarious situations, that means foregoing essentials. For people who are in less precarious situations, it does also affect them too, in the sense that maybe they're spending so much on housing that they're not able to really fully plan for the future. Think about getting that next degree or moving, or think about that. So housing is something that is fundamental to sort of the quality of life for everyone. In Boston, 2/3 of households are renters. Between 2009 and 2015, the median gross rent in Boston increased by nearly 5%, while the inflation-adjusted median household income of renters decreased by nearly 4%. So basically what that translates into is that people in Boston and also people around the nation are seeing more and more of their income go towards housing costs, which is a problem. And this has material effects. So the map on the left is a depiction of where evictions are happening in Boston. Basically, what happens is that evictions can occur not only when people can't pay their rent, they also occur in cases where a landlord may be interested in moving in higher income tenants into the building. And so they might ask the current tenants to move out, they renovate the building, and now they can no longer live there, and they're pushed into a housing market that's growing increasingly scarce as far as affordable options go. And as you can see, if you look at the neighborhoods that are most impacted by evictions because of discrimination, housing segregation, and systemic exclusion from housing and credit options, communities of color and Black neighborhoods specifically, Roxbury, Dorchester, Mattapan, have really dealt with the brunt of this housing insecurity and housing instability. There have been organizations that have historically and now are really stepping up to sort of face this crisis, and we're doing so before the pandemic. So the signs here say equity, not inclusion, before profit. I think things that we can agree on from this grassroots organization, City Life Vida Urbana, which has done incredible work in Boston to sort of stave off evictions and keep people in their homes. And just to note, just to emphasize, this was already a crisis even before the pandemic. The idea that people didn't really have safe and affordable places to live, not only in expensive places like Metro Boston, but around the nation. So let's get to COVID. So the pandemic happened, and the headlines weren't much better. The coronavirus pandemic is worsening the US housing crisis and could lead to greater inequality. 31%, so around a third of people or a third of renters couldn't pay the rent with the potential of that to get worse. In Massachusetts, we saw thousands of people filing jobless claims. And this article was from the 16th. It's now the 22nd. And things are moving so quickly with this that there are probably a lot more individuals now that have sort of been in that position. So we see the housing crisis where things were already unaffordable. People were already sort of stressed out about housing. We see that exacerbated by the economic crisis. In addition, we see the same neighborhoods and the same places bearing the brunt of that. So in this map, everything in dark pink are areas where people are least likely to work from home. Those are people working in service occupations or in transportation, in manufacturing. Everything in the lightest pink are areas where people are more likely to be able to work from home. So that's people who work in sales, business, management, things like that. So as you can see, those same neighborhoods, you can see Dorchester, Mattapan, you can see Everett, Chelsea, Revere, East Boston. These areas are places where there are a lot of frontline workers living or people who perhaps worked in the service industry that were basically laid off as a result of the pandemic. So not only do you have increased exposure associated with COVID-19 for these places, in addition to housing insecurity, you also have this job insecurity aspect as well. However, I know it's a lot of doom and gloom, but there is some really great news. A couple of days ago, Governor Baker passed an act that prohibited evictions and foreclosures during the health crisis, which basically means landlords cannot, force people from their homes in the middle of a global pandemic, a thing I think we can all agree is great and also necessary, but also sort of like the baseline for what care people should be receiving during this unprecedented time. So it also provides some additional flexibility for tenants who, if they can't pay, for landlords, if they have expenses, to sort of take that from the first and last. For those of you who have rented an apartment before, you usually have to pay first month and last month. So it allows some flexibility there and stops late fees and negative reporting on credit scores. So that's great. And it took the work of so many grassroots activists. The housing justice world in Massachusetts really mobilized to get this done. I think so many calls were made by so many different people who really cared about this, whether for themselves, their neighbors, or just generally believed in this, which was really exciting. However, there's still more work to be done. There are a ton of organizations working on housing in Boston now. This is a short list, but there are plenty more. And some of those organizations, and all those organizations now are really focused on how do we keep people in their homes? How do we keep people sort of in stable conditions when the health risks are really high. So an important thing to note, even with an eviction moratorium, renters are still required to pay rent. For those out of work or unable to access unemployment, this is a financial burden. So we could come out of this pandemic a couple months from now, people may not have paid their rent, they may have been able to stay in their home, but then they owe thousands of dollars. That's something that's untenable, especially because a lot of people don't have saved money lying around. I know that I don't have an extra few $1,000s here and there. So I think that this issue, despite the fact that we have a temporary fix with the moratorium and a great victory in that, there's still more thought to be done of what to do about this crisis. So let's think about like what a tenant, or in some cases, small scale property owners who perhaps they maybe own one property, maybe don't have a great income, and still have to sort of pay the mortgage on that property. So what can those individuals do if they're out of work? And I think we can sort of do a little thought exercise here. One thing is that they can rent strike or negotiate with the party who is owed money. For tenants, that's the landlord, and for small scale property owners, that's the bank. And to answer the question in the Q&A, that bill didn't include freezing rent. It basically, people are still have to pay their rent, even though landlords are not allowed to sort of initiate an eviction proceeding. So yeah, like tenants can essentially, they can rent strike, they can negotiate with the party that's owed money, which is a good option, and also sort of like redefines the relationship between tenant and landlord, or property owner and the bank in the case of a small scale property owner. However, with that, at the end of the pandemic, long-term debt may still be owed. In the long run, households may still be severely burdened by debt if that is something that like they have to pay back. There are also limited financial resources for those who are out of work. There's state emergency rental assistance called RAFT. There's unemployment. There's the CARES Act stimulus for households that qualify. There's city level rental assistance funds depending on where you live, and also forbearance and payment deferment for homeowners, where the bank basically allows them to sort of defer payments on mortgages. So these are all good programs and helpful for people who need frontline assistance now. However, if you think about it, there's an enormous administration burden to providing these resources. For a lot of under-resourced communities, it takes a lot of effort to get people this aid. If you think about it, there are probably a lot of people who are dealing with a number of things, from concerns about their health, they have children at home. For immigrant households who may not have perfect English, doing all this administrative work is exhausting. And so trying to get all this stuff done, given the delays in the system, I think is really, really hard for people, and the rent is still due. And so tenant and low-income property owners are really put in a position where they're supposed to procure resources in a really patchwork manner in order to make rent. So here's an example of a headline. Vice called all the unemployment offices in all 50 states. Only 2 are picking up, and so there's huge backlogs of unemployment filings. There's an article, 9 reasons your stimulus payment may be delayed, ? That, why that's a listicle, I think, is a question that we should all be asking. This is a more of involved, piece of text here, but basically the city of Boston established a rental relief fund, which was great, and good thinking by city officials. However, it's just not enough funding for the scale of the crisis, which is to say that 800 applicants were chosen by lottery out of around 5,500 applicants. So we really see that it's really hard to sort of piece together resources to address this. One solution is guaranteed long-term relief. At the state level, a bunch of housing organizations have put together this Healthy Housing Guarantee petition, which not only asks for the banning of evictions and foreclosures, a thing that has happened, but also the cancellation of rent and mortgages, and the sort of forgiveness of any new housing debt. And finally, the support of unhoused people who don't even have access to shelter right now. And yes, there was a question about landlords and property managers. I think that, rent strikes are a way to sort of for people to negotiate. But yeah, I think as far as them being a long-term solution, I think that that's something that's difficult to sort of address without sort of larger kind of legislation. And so here's a national piece of legislation called the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act, which is, we love a simple title. Basically, it's a solution for guaranteed long-term renters relief, which basically reframes the mechanisms for aid and creates a relief fund for landlords and mortgage holders, people who have to essentially pay mortgages, to apply to the government to cover losses from canceled payments. And so what is nice about this is that typically, although there's some sort of cases where this isn't the case, homeowners are not, the people who own properties versus their tenants are likely to be wealthier. And so therefore, it's okay, or it's at least like better to put the onus of sort of the administrative burden of applying for relief on them, as opposed to tenants who are basically, you know, scrambling oftentimes to try to pay rent with limited funds that they have. So this bill is, I think, is something that is a great piece of legislation. Okay, so this moment in history really begs the fundamental question, and I think that you all are here because you are asking this yourself. What if we all had a right to safe and affordable and stable housing? And with that, and as we sort of lead into Gwen's piece, which will come next, what if we were able to rely not just purely on, you know, housing provided by private landlords, but what if we had a stronger base of social housing in this country, housing that is publicly owned and sort of governed and guaranteed to people that need it? I'm just gonna check the Q&A. Okay, looks like we don't have any questions. Great, so now that we've sort of talked about COVID-19 and the housing crisis, I'm gonna pass it to Gwen to talk about the contents of the Green New Deal, the Green New Deal for Public Housing bill.
Great, thank you, Saritha. So, as Saritha has led us to this question, why this bill? Why the Green New Deal for public housing? We know that the current situation outside is pretty dismal in regards to housing, and it's only being exacerbated by COVID. So right now there's a need for immediate relief, like the People's Bailout and like Medicare for All, and we're pushing for these things. But the next thing we need to be thinking about is long-term, so this involves a Green New Deal. And what we know about a Green New Deal is it's a plan to move the economy towards clean renewable energy, supplying low carbon green jobs to anyone who would like one, and at the same time mitigating inequalities, especially on frontline communities. So a Green New Deal, it doesn't just mean cutting carbon, it means dignified work, it means dignified living, and fortunately these go hand in hand with climate change action. And so this is important to Sunrise because Sunrise is working to combat climate change. And what we know right now is we need long-term lasting change in order to become more resilient as crises like this unfortunately become more normal. And what's great about the Green New Deal is it can be used as a tool for climate-focused economic recovery here. Because in this strange time we're in, there's this chance to redirect or direct trillions of dollars of government investment, and that's going to happen whether or not a Green New Deal is part of this. So now is the time to really be pushing and amplifying our voices for the real need for legislation like this. So what's really fantastic about the Green New Deal is it's held up by pillars of justice. Justice is really at the heart of this, and you can see these 6 boxes here. But the one we're focusing on for the purpose of this presentation, obviously they're all intertwined, but really the right to safe and healthy home and work environments without being forced to choose between unhealthy livelihoods and unemployment. This is the key right here. So really, everybody deserves access to affordable and safe housing. And as Saritha was mentioning in the earlier part of the presentation, we know that housing is an issue of incredible magnitude right now, between homelessness, between really unaffordable rents. Millions of people are affected every day, even without a pandemic. So it's really easy right now to see the direct connections between housing, climate, and COVID. So our next slide here shows a snapshot of all the forms of rental assistance that exist across the US today. So there is much more than just public housing. There's Section 8 housing, there's housing choice voucher programs, there's many different forms, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're focusing on this darker orange shade, which is about 1 million households, just under 1 million households are housed in public housing units. And so this number equates to about 2 million people, because it's not always just one person per household. And unfortunately, the public housing stock has long gone through really being underfunded and not having the resources that it needs. So it's fallen to a state of disrepair in a lot of situations. 10 years ago, the Department of Housing and Urban Development estimated almost $90 billion worth of repairs were needed. And that's only to address things like mold and lead contamination, poor indoor air quality, and unsafe temperatures. And so this is really just to uplift housing to truly a livable state where people can feel healthy and safe. And so clearly with these negative outcomes, or clearly these things lead to negative health outcomes, especially higher rates of asthma. And then you compound that with a pandemic, especially respiratory illness, that really adds to the problematic situation at hand. So of course, we know, and it's, I feel like always in the news, or becoming more and more in the news, that these things are all interrelated. Economic and racial inequalities are directly connected to the climate crisis and to pandemics. We know that 4 million children live in households exposed to high levels of lead. We know that the rates of asthma are continuing to increase as air pollution increases. And we know that there's disparities there, where 1 in 13 Americans have asthma, but the rate is nearly 2 times higher amongst Black Americans. And we also know that access to open space and recreation is not equitably distributed. We can look at this next map, and this is a snapshot taken from Data for Progress, who put together some really great maps. And you can go onto their website and check out the different layers. And the maps show the entire US, but this, of course, is just looking at Greater Boston. And the black dots you see there, those represent sites of public housing units. And then there are various layers that you can overlap onto these maps, so you can uncheck and check boxes to look at correlations between unemployment, poverty, and percent non-white. And so I invite you to take a look there. But this map really just shows that green investments in public housing and low-income workers across the country are going to help lift up underinvested communities countrywide. In addition to this, of course, there are nearly 2.6 million American Indian and Alaskan Natives, indigenous groups across the country. And I think recently we've been seeing a lot about Navajo Nation in the news because COVID has really horribly kind of devastated that area. In the Southwest, amongst indigenous groups, 14.2% of households are not connected to an electricity grid. And currently we know that what's being reported and could potentially be much higher is that COVID rates are 10 times higher per capita than that of neighboring communities in Arizona. And the reason for this is twofold. It has to do with the chronic housing shortage that is already existing, where a lot of homes are housed by multiple generations. And so you're forcing, or more people are forced to live in smaller confined spaces. So it's more difficult to physically, socially distance. In addition to 15% of Navajo Nation homes have no running water. So when the CDC is encouraging people to be washing hands for 20 seconds at least, that is virtually impossible. So these things can be, the housing shortages can be filled by increasing funding to match population and match infrastructure demands, but these things can also be paired with extensive retrofits, which is where this falls into the Green New Deal for public housing. So now we can take a look there and see what actually this bill outlines. So what we know about this piece of legislation is it's the first one of hopefully many. It was introduced by Representative Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Sanders this past November 2019. And the Green New Deal for public housing lays out the foundation for just making housing a human right. And the three umbrellas of this piece of legislation are healthy, safe, affordable housing, good low carbon jobs, and also decarbonizing through things like retrofits. So that begs the question, what exactly is a retrofit? Retrofits are essentially ways to maintain and preserve homes for longer amounts of time so that they last longer, and also uplifting them to be more energy efficient. So some examples of this would include replacing appliances, upgrading windows so that cold air can't seep in the wintertime, upgrading heating and cooling systems to be electrified and therefore more energy efficient as the grid moves to be more electric. And then also placing solar panels on rooftops. And there are advantages to these retrofits because they force homes and buildings to reduce their energy usage because they're more efficient. And that, of course, reduces utility costs. And when utility costs are driven down, that makes units more affordable. And we already know that public housing units require $89 billion in repairs. So this really puts us in a great position to mitigate climate change through retrofits at the same time. Other advantages here, of course, they cut carbon, they improve health and well-being, they create jobs in areas that may have higher unemployment, and most importantly, they really offer this opportunity to really rethink public housing units, not just as homes, but as these small-scale utilities with the capacity to generate renewable energy. If you're putting and installing major solar panels amongst buildings and institutions, this enables the Public Housing Authority to then sell that energy that's created back to the grid and therefore retain 90% of the profit. So it's an additional way to bring revenue and the ability to keep up with the work that needs to continue being done to keep them at a high living standard. One example of a community renewable grid was already done, and they're popping up in different parts around the country. But community renewables are essentially delocalized from the national grid. And one example is in Blue Lake, California, amongst a tribal nation there. And their reservation operates energy independently from the grid. In their case, it's Pacific Gas and Electric. But they create this energy, sell it back to the grid, and therefore maintain some profit. And it's estimated to save them over $200,000 a year in annual energy costs. It's also grown clean energy jobs amongst this tribal nation by 10%. So taking this and then scaling it to public housing units would be, this is a great framework. Now, the Green New Deal for public housing has basically 6 goals. And these goals range from overall climate adaptation, so that when natural disasters do hit or severe heat hit, there are places and spaces for people to be and feel safe. In addition, it also includes modernizing and enhancing so that things are up to speed and they are livable given the 21st century standards. Another important piece of this is that public housing units are maintained as a safety net for all people, so that it is a form of housing that exists for anyone who needs it. In addition to the eradication of mold and lead and getting out the negative health outcomes. And the final piece here is repealing unjust barriers to public housing access, like the Faircloth Amendment, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But essentially, it's put a cap on and preventing any new public housing units from being built. And so our big question is the finances. One of the big questions is, how do we pay for this? And so Data for Progress actually crunched these numbers, and they found that for up to $172 billion in green retrofits, updates and repairs. This equates to roughly 1% of the cost of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017. So just by that one act a couple years ago, with all that money that went to large corporations and executives, that 1% is the amount of money that's needed to do these kinds of repairs. So the money is there, it's just a matter of distributing it to the places that it could be really, could really change the game. So this brings us to the basic human needs. We know that basic human needs are water, food, air, and shelter. And right now, the current crisis is not allowing us to meet those. And this is why we are advocating for immediate actions like the People's Bailout and Medicare for All. But Sunrise is specifically invested in this piece of legislation because the strategy here involves building a movement, and no one is equipped to join a movement or even prioritize climate change when housing is not meeting your needs. And we know that this movement needs everyone, and so this is why we advocate for a Green New Deal for public housing. And then for our last wrap up here, access to healthy housing is linked to climate mitigation. And a transition to green recovery is how we avoid this urgent need for immediate relief when the next crisis hits. In a green recovery, federal assistance helps transition homes and businesses to renewable energy, and this helps clean up air and prevent respiratory diseases. A green transition also involves the creation of federally funded green jobs with worker protections so that people can return to work in dignified workforces. And finally, Housing for All prevents this dual crisis between homelessness and COVID that we're seeing right now. So with that, we are going to turn it over to our first action of the day, and I'll turn it back to Saritha.
Great. So thank you, Gwen, for teaching us about the tenets of the bill. That I think is something that is going to be really, really helpful for us to do when we do further actions. But as of right now, we are trying to, in addition to thinking about this national legislation and this long-term recovery and all these big picture things Gwen was just talking about, we also want to be supportive of local COVID-19 housing crisis, sort of how things are happening now. And so as a result, we're going to take a little break, but it's not really a break because you're going to do an action and it's going to be really sick. So you are going to sign the Healthy Housing Guarantee petition and share that with 4 other people. So basically this petition has been advanced by a number of leading housing organizations in Massachusetts. It calls for the cancellation of rent and mortgage payments for those affected during the emergency, and guarantees that tenants and homeowners will not be burdened by long-term debt, and also asks for additional resources for the unhoused and those who do not have access to shelter right now. So if you could go to www.housingguarantee.org, sign that petition, and if you could share it on your social media or share with 4 others and do a personal tap, that would be great. And if you have done it, it would be cool if you could put a plus in the chat so we know that we're all doing it, we're all working together to make this happen. And I think they have reached the number of signatures that they want, but I'm sure a few more signatures could not hurt. Adrian, while folks are doing that, maybe you could introduce yourself. Our 3rd panelist has arrived.
Hello, thanks for letting me join a little late. I'm Adrian Horn. I'll be helping with co-hosting today, the rest of the workshop. Thanks, Saritha and Gwen, for getting us started with an awesome action too.
Mhm.
Happy to have you here. All right, we see a question coming in. How can the state legislate a mortgage payment cessation when the people who own mortgages are national groups in other states?
I actually don't know the sort of like full legal answer behind that. I think that there, I mean, to sort of like legislate like, oh, people don't have to necessarily like pay mortgages within the state level. Yeah, I think that's probably something that's legally complicated. Another option would be for states to open up funds for people who have missed rent payments, sort of like akin to the sort of national legislation that Representative Omar presented. So maybe not like legally. I think that there's a lot of pathways for this, and it's still kind of an unclear situation. But as of right now, I think that we can be sort of outcome focused, which is to say that like, what is it do we want to see? Do we want people who are unable to access sort of fundamental aid to still have to make those payments, I think is the question. So yeah, I mean, hopefully, I know that's not like a fully logistically helpful answer, but I think it's something that is sort of on the sort of housing justice docket when thinking about the pandemic.
Great. It's great to see these plus signs coming in for this action being accomplished. Thanks, everybody.
Wow, so many actions.
You guys are lovely. That's amazing.
Any other questions while people finish things up? Can add them in the Q&A. We'll be happy to answer.
Looks like we have a question. What distinguishes all the different kinds of public housing Gwen mentioned earlier?
Let's see. So the distinguishing factor here is basically, I'm actually not positive if it has to do with income or if it's a choice system. With public housing, I know that tenants are expected to pay up to 30% of their income towards living expenses in the public housing, but I'm actually not positive about some of the others.
So I think it's, as far as the chart, I think if that's what you're referring to in your question, that sort of showed the sort of composition of subsidized housing stock. So I think what distinguishes public housing from those other categories beyond sort of that it might operate logistically differently as far as like income levels go, is that public housing is publicly owned. It's fundamentally like publicly owned units. Whereas for other housing, it might be subsidies that go towards private developers, affordable housing developers who manage that unit directly and are sort of responsible for operating costs, even though they receive subsidies from the government to charge lower rents so that they're affordable. Okay, I think.
Looks like Laura chimed in a little bit too. So that's.
Yeah, thank you. That's all.
Thanks.
Cool. I think we have a little bit more time. So if folks have any other questions, we can take them. Otherwise, just happy to see all the plus signs come in for all of you who are doing this. There's a lot of you on here right now too. We've got around 50 people, so that's really exciting.
Yeah. Back to our opening intro question about what you can see outside. I'm hearing these blue jays like really freak out at each other right now. They're going real crazy out there. I don't know if you can hear them through my microphone, but they
You
are.
should have put what can you hear outside your window too.
Yeah.
There's also some additional info that Jess provided in our chat. So when we did this training, I just want to shout out Jess. We answered a question. We did this training originally a couple months ago. Before all of this, Jess was one of our key organizers on it. So she's provided some additional information, which is there is federally funded and state funded public housing and some that are both. In Massachusetts, there are various types of housing that go towards various types of people. For example, there's housing that goes specifically for families and specifically for the elderly. And as we'll talk about, and we get into the sort of history and trajectory of public housing, there's currently this push right now to sort of say like, oh, like public housing hasn't really worked properly. Like, let's, create mixed sort of private public housing that has some market rate units. So units that like would be the cost of any other, I guess, unit on the market in Boston, mixed with subsidized or affordable lower rent units.
Thanks, Jess.
Cool. Should we go to the next one? Do you think?
Yeah, it looks like we've slowed down.
All right. Okay. So our next activity, because we're not in person, we still wanted to try and engage with you in some fashion. So we're going to go through a little thought exercise here on housing and our personal histories. So we invite you to use the chat function to share your responses to this next series of questions that we'll be asking. And our first question will be, all right, so we want you to think about somewhere you have lived, and it could be where you're currently living or somewhere you've lived in the past, and what did you like about your house or apartment? And you can plop these into the chat. Something that I really liked about home was just being able to walk various places very easily. Oh, and I'm seeing some responses here. Really like being close to my church so I can walk there, walkability. Access to nature and clean air, backyard and green space, ponds, being able to walk. Yes.
Classic Sunrise answer.
Living across the street from a park, near the woods, near public transit and subway. Hot water, that's a big one. Open space, close to park and large windows. Nice not having to get up at 6:30 for school. Green space and walking. Oh, they're coming in so fast. This is great. Urbanism, feeling safe, near transportation. Places that someone's liked living that's directly proportional to public transit and walking access, lots of things to do. Living in a house in Boston, easy to get around, good internet connection, nice landlord, living near a park with beautiful trees and the pink cherry blossoms, love it, near the forest, walking, spacious, maintenance request answered quickly. These are all excellent. Thank you so much for sharing. All right, and so now I would like to ask, in relation to this question, what did you like about the neighborhood town? Some of you have maybe been answering that already, but feel free to add anything else about specific to your neighborhood or town, city. A lot of room for your cat. I like that. Public transit, friendly neighbors, easy to get anywhere, feeling safe. Fantastic. Library, a sense of community and shared progressive values. A lot of echoing for public transit and opportunities to socialize. mental health and social health and physical health. Boston Pride. Diversity. Walking distance to the Charles. Police who are concerned about their citizens. Close to food, near nature, safety. Great, thank you. All right, we're gonna move on to our next set of questions. Now we'd like you to think about something you did not like about your house or apartment, and please drop your responses into the chat. Very small. Windows don't close and heat that doesn't work. That is not ideal in this part of the country. Rodents, landlords that were not responsive, high utility bills, unclean with vermin and cockroaches, pests, a lot of noise near a highway, so you're getting that sound pollution, wind that gets through windows, draftiness, too far from things, having to drive to get places, leaky ceilings, the rent is too damn high, locks that don't work, leaks and old broken appliances, high rent with lots of plus signs, drafty, needing more sunlight and lower rent. Yes, it's confirming to see a lot of similar sentiments out there. All right, and now what did you not like about your neighborhood, town, or city? Please share. Trash on the roads, public transit too far, the residents hate the possibility of affordable housing, no diversity, too expensive, gentrification, toxic communities, don't feel safe biking, no community, high rates of violence. Yeah. All right, we're gonna move on to our next slide here. Now take a moment to think about how the places you've lived have affected your health and your financial well-being and your opportunities or some opportunities you have been able to access based on where you are living. Take a minute to think about these and please share if you're comfortable. You can think about places of work or school or going to schools that were not really well resourced, living in school districts with high achieving public schools where most people went to college and that was kind of the norm. Very homogeneous and insular. Lead in the pipes, which is not great for health. Having a mortgage and paying much less than others around this person who pay more for the same kind of space. Green space that helps mental health, public transportation is accessible for family. Access to good public education is a big privilege. No good town gym. Vermin and high utility bills lead to anxiety. Access to conservation lands that is good for mental health. NIMBYism, second the green space, being scared of pollution from Superfund site and exposure to toxins. Before moving to Boston, didn't have access to public transit and severely limited ability to get around. Triple-decker home, so we benefit from rental income and can welcome extended family and friends to live in our house. These are really great thoughts. Thank you all for sharing. We're going to move on to our final slide for this section. And to tie this all together, how do you think where you have lived has affected your friendships and your sense of community? Just take a minute, think about that, and share if you would like to. Elementary school was somewhat racially segregated. Been trying to unlearn the messages about white supremacy since then. Living with friends relatively close by is incredible, and knowing folks who own businesses around is really great. When I lived in a suburb where houses were spread apart, I had no car, it was hard to meet up with people my age, so I didn't have much of a community feel. Yeah. Living with others has helped keep me positive and bond with others, but it also poses a challenge when I want to be alone. Yep. We're getting some good plus signs. Thank you. All right. So thank you for partaking in this thought exercise with us. Oh, a couple more coming in. Rich white kids that don't care about climate and don't give me a sense of community. Yep, and definitely had different levels of community in different places I've been. Difference is openness and acceptance of difference. Yep, very good. Okay. This area stresses education and awareness. Great. Some excellent responses there, and hopefully that got us all thinking just a little bit about how a house is really so much more than just a physical structure. From these responses, we're seeing so many interconnections between mental health and physical health and proximity to loved ones and neighbors and friends, and the ability to get to work or get to be able to run errands. All of these things that make up our livelihood and how they're also interconnected and sourced in your home space. And so this is really getting at the core of why we are doing this training today, is we're pushing for housing as a human right. And because we can see just how much housing impacts our day-to-day lives. And so we want to be fighting for the right for housing for everyone. So with that, we are going to jump into the history of public housing, which will be led by Sarita. So I'm going to turn it over to her.
Great, thanks. Now that you've had the ability to sort of learn about you've learned about the sort of the housing crisis here in Massachusetts, how it relates to the pandemic and COVID-19, the contents of the Green New Deal for public housing and how that fits in. And now you've had the opportunity to reflect a little bit on where you all come from and your sort of experiences with housing at various points in your lives. And an important thing to note, and I think Gwen put it really well earlier, is that when we're thinking about this, we really need to be thinking about it as a collective project. And that is to say that when you learn about the history of public housing, and even in some of the content that you've seen now, you've seen a lot about sort of how a lot of people in this country don't have good access to housing, or the housing that they have is unsafe or actively a detriment to their health. And I think the point of this is that even for those of us who really have never really dealt with unsafe housing or have never really dealt with unstable or unaffordable housing, for all of us to really see that, yes, like housing should be a human right, and for all of us to sort of be in solidarity on that point. It's not for us to necessarily, like, the point of a training isn't to, if you are privileged, to necessarily like make you feel bad about that privilege, but to really point towards like the necessity for all of us to rethink what rights essentially are in this country as they are right now, especially during this moment. So with that, here's the history of public housing. We began in the 1930s, as a lot of Sunrise lectures often do, with the New Deal and the promise of public housing. So a lot of workers were displaced by the Great Depression. As we sort of all kind of understand, it was a moment of deep sort of economic insecurity, much like this moment now. So FDR signed the US Housing Act in 1937, which provided loans to cities to build public housing. So cities then conducted what were called slum clearances of working class and informal housing and built affordable public housing units for middle class people. An important thing to note as we go through this history is that this was a federally administrated program, and public housing is administered oftentimes from the federal level. It's oftentimes left up to individual local authorities to do the actual construction, operation, and implementation. And so therefore, when we think about sort of how public housing is manifested in communities, it's oftentimes been subject to like the fears, the worries, the hopes, and ambitions of individual communities. So I think there's sort of an interesting interplay between what people want on the local level and sort of like the national agenda when it comes to this topic area. And through this act, so cities were basically like they were clearing areas that they felt were slums or areas where working class people were living. What was interesting is that I think oftentimes the conception of public housing is one where people sort of view public housing essentially as something that is for low-income people. At the time, public housing played a really interesting role, basically, where they really felt that they could basically displace working class communities and bring in a more like middle-income kind of tenant. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. Even though public housing was really intended to improve urban areas, it did displace people. So this is Old Harbor Village in Boston, and it is the oldest public housing development in New England. I think it's in the South End and still exists today. So in the 40s, public housing continued to house individuals. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act was passed in 1944, which guaranteed loans for returning GIs. But if you look at this photo and this advertisement for this loan program, you can notice that that GI is a white GI. Returning veterans who were Black or other veterans of color were not provided these same benefits. And what's really important to note is that the wealth generated from people's ability to access housing as a result of this loan is something that like perpetuates this sort of wealth gap that exists in this country today, or this racial wealth gap. And so like, I think that even though this was like a long time ago, ostensibly, it is something that like really, really has shaped communities for decades and up until now, this sort of deprivation of that benefit. So in the 40s, a lot of people were asking who is public housing for, and we were sort of moving out of the paradigm that was in the 30s about sort of social services and safety nets, where we had individual interests like real estate and corporate groups that were more interested in pushing government subsidies for private housing and argued more that public housing should be for low-income individuals and not be a middle-income, type thing. Still, there was public funding or funding for public housing in the Housing Act of 1949, shortly after the war. But there was lobbying in individual communities that reduced the number of units built from the amount that was originally authorized. So I don't know if you've ever been to Lubbock, but this is a poster from there, which asks, do you believe in socialism? No. Is public housing socialism? Yes. So I think the stigma as to like what social housing is in this country, I think is something that it goes back a long time. And even though we see it today, it has a longer history. However, in the 50s, we did see a heyday of public housing. There was a lot of public housing built following that act in Boston and many other urban areas. We do see the sort of same thing where public housing was slated to be built following neighborhood clearance and was restricted to tenants with higher incomes than those that were displaced by this clearance. So I don't know if you all are familiar with the West End in Boston, but it used to be this sort of working class neighborhood. They cleared it, built units that were actually more expensive. than then basically like than the people who were displaced could essentially afford. So that's another piece of history. And this sort of practice and tactic of sort of doing these really, really big projects to change things and displacing people was called urban renewal. And in the meantime, while this was happening, home loans provided to returning GIs post-World War II spurred a lot of private suburban housing development. So you could sort of see that what you think of as a suburban community, these sort of like cookie cutter type homes. And to reiterate, those loans provided to returning GIs for white GIs and white households to move out into the suburbs. The federal government simultaneously was directing funds towards infrastructure projects, including highways, which would allow suburban commuters to come into the city, get work done, and then drive out back to their families. And so that really diverted select populations, and at the same time created these types of extraction zones around the highways where Black and brown communities, people who had fewer housing options in these sort of inner cores, saw highways, saw transportation infrastructure cutting through neighborhoods, and also like changing and fundamentally changing their neighborhood and increasing the amount of pollution and sort of public health hazards there. So we can see how housing is sort of like linked to a lot of health outcomes, in addition to sort of how you are within your housing, but also sort of the infrastructure around how we think of housing and who housing is for. There was some urban activism that occurred in the 60s to sort of protest some of these projects, and some cool things did happen. So in some cases, people were able to defer funding to more community-led efforts to improve quality of life in cities. So this is Via Victoria, a community that still exists today. And they basically won the rights and the funding to develop their own community for their sort of Puerto Rican residents. So the idea is that they had more autonomy over their housing development, which was a great victory to have won through organizing. In 1969, there was also the People Before Highways rally, which basically prevented a highway from cutting through the South End, Roxbury, and Jamaica Plain, and sort of really displacing the neighborhoods there. And it was a really interesting coalition of people, everyone from like white environmentalists, urban planning professors, to Black activists who came together to fight this project and won. But going back to public housing, in the 60s and 70s, racial integration proved to be really divisive. Oftentimes, white families who could afford to move elsewhere and access the credit market did. So another important point to note is, in addition to not being provided access to that GI Bill and the loan associated with it, non-white households oftentimes faced really strong discrimination, and still do, when it comes to getting credit or access to a mortgage. Beyond sort of the prospect of homeownership, individual landlords and apartment owners also times were racially discriminatory in choosing who was going to be allowed to live there. And so as a result, you saw a lot of white households moving out of public housing. So you saw a really huge demographic change from 1964, where Boston's 6 large public housing properties were 80% white, and by 1970, they were 70% Black. And at the same time, the Brooke Amendment in 1969 capped rent as a share of tenant income, which was intended to be a good thing, which is to say that like no tenant should be paying X percentage more out of their income. However, because middle income tenants were leaving, and there wasn't enough funding to sort of keep up with their share of that rent, a lot of the funding for public housing units was reduced, and there wasn't additional funding coming through to keep those units in repair. And as a result, public housing gained this like really sort of fraught stigma, especially among white suburbanites who viewed public housing in this very racially identifiable way, and with this really huge racial and class bias. By 1973, President Nixon described public housing projects as monstrous, depressing places, run down, overcrowded, and crime-ridden. So you can see how these events have sort of led up to like what people oftentimes think of when they think of public housing. In the 1980s and the 1990s, further cuts to federal housing aid budgets reduced the quality of public housing even further. If you've been to other Sunrise trainings, you know about the Reagan alignment, you know about sort of how government was essentially cut to pieces during this time, and there was a lot less funding out there for government programs. And so, the situation became even more dire. This is sort of a parallel to housing, but I think really important to bring up and also relevant to this bill. In the 80s, while there were cuts to housing budgets or sort of government housing budgets, while that was occurring, the Reagan administration was also radically weakening the bargaining power of labor and unions, which isn't necessarily like a housing issue, but is an issue of quality of life. If where you work sort of treats you as disposable, your workplace isn't safe, and beyond that, like isn't paying you fair wages, and you have no negotiating power. In addition to sort of thinking about the quality and affordability of housing, we're thinking about people's ability to have livelihoods and to make a life. And I think that while housing cuts were happening simultaneously, these erosions to sort of labor power were happening as well. In the 90s, there was some additional hope for public housing through the Hope 6 program, which was to do what Jess mentioned, which is to sort of bring urban design principles as a solution and sort of mix public housing with market rate housing. It had mixed results in that like public housing was radically underfunded. So to bring in more funds for that was good, but we did see, you know, some people criticized it as elitist, as being led by urban designers and not really in consultation with any kind of community. And in the 90s, as Gwen mentioned, we got that Faircloth Amendment passed, which prevented the use of federal funds to construct new public housing without the removal of existing units. And so I think this is important as it is a historical event and it's a sort of, you know, as a legal impediment to essentially this bill. But beyond it, I think it signals something that is really, I think, fraught, is that people by then sort of realized or thought that they had realized that social housing had failed, that public housing was no longer something that we could consider as a nation, as something that was really like viable. And I think that we think about this, but also if you look at the longer history of that, you can see that the reason why there were so many problems with public housing was not because of the construct of social housing, but rather the sort of underfunding, the mismanagement, the sort of levels by which the ability for housing authorities to actually do the work they needed to do was kind of basically like that was undermined by all of these sort of funding cuts. Today, as Gwen mentioned, public housing developments face issues with backlogs of repairs. If you know the New York City Housing Authority or NYCHA, they had a ton of issues with lead, and they had a ton of issues with mold and, you know, not providing heating during winter. So a lot of public housing units today are still facing some of these issues and the health consequences that come with them. As Jess also mentioned earlier, Trump's HUD, so his Housing and Urban Development Agency, wants to expand a program that would privatize public housing, which preserves affordability for some, but turns over land and housing and building stock to private developers, which puts tenants vulnerable and at the mercy of private developers, even though there might be some legislative you know, things that they're required to do to provide affordable housing. It's not really the same thing as social housing. So some key points in this history is that racial discrimination in housing choice and in wealth building is integral to understanding the story of public housing. Improvements to urban areas and neighborhoods have left people behind, even when they had good intentions. And lastly, there is a stigma to public housing that must be changed if we want this bill and other sort of social housing efforts to go through, which is filtered towards a larger animus towards the poor, which is racialized, and fears of socialism. So social housing in this country has never really been something that I think has been something that is fraught because of the way it's been treated. And I think that if we want to think about like this new bill and the sort of new ability for social housing to provide people with what they fundamentally deserve, which is good shelter, affordable and safe housing, we have to think about like this stigma as it exists in the American consciousness. And with that, I think I'm gonna check to see if there are questions. So there is a question about an infrastructure bank, which I think was from before. I don't have too much information about that. I think that is something that was a part of sort of accompanying sort of plans to this bill, but I don't know if it's actually within the bill, unless you all know.
I cannot speak to that either, but these are good questions and we can definitely look into them.
Yeah, we will do that. Okay.
All right, so.
Another question.
Oh.
Saritha, could you say more about how housing over time led to prosperity for some? If you didn't get housing, you suffer from more inequality now, ties between wealth and housing?
Sure, yeah. So if you think about, I think there's a lot of different sort of buckets by which you could answer that question, or sort of categories. One is even purely through inherited wealth. So if your grandparents were able to get a house, or were able to sort of access loans or sort of policy, were able to access what the benefits were provided by the government to get a piece of property and own that piece of property, that house has a lot of worth that gets passed down to your parents, perhaps might get passed down to you. For individuals that were unable to access government programs or subsidized loans to get access to that, they spend, historically have been spending money on, paying for shelter, so paying rent, and they don't have that sort of fixed asset, which is a home. And beyond that, I think that we can also think about some of the social, educational sort of factors associated with housing, which is to say that, like, okay, so for example, school districts are oftentimes funded by individual property taxes. If you're living in an area where people are wealthy and you have access to a home, your school is going to be better. Maybe you have the ability to get into college, to make more money than someone who didn't have that ability. So I think that there's not only the sort of direct ties of like, okay, like what wealth is conveyed by the ability to gain access to an asset, and also the wealth that is conveyed by like the sort of the living situation that you're living in, and the fact that certain things in this country are not conveyed equally, like health and like education, and that are tied to housing.
Great. So with that, we're going to transition to speaking a little bit more about the details in the Green New Deal for Public Housing bill. And so you can take a minute now to look at the 3 pillars by the numbers. There's the healthy housing piece, the decarbonization piece, and the good green jobs piece. And so these metrics, they're all put together by Data for Progress, as we were mentioning earlier, with the maps, but Data for Progress has crunched a lot of these numbers, and they've put together a really fantastic report. So if you're interested in further learning on this topic, we do recommend that as a source. But first, we're going to talk a little bit about healthy housing, and on the next slide, we have some details on this. So when we talk about healthy housing and what that looks like, we came up with some pieces of this in our thought exercise a bit ago. But really, healthy housing is repairs and updates that are necessary to improve physical and mental health, safety, and comfort. And what this looks like is multifold here. So when thinking about resilience to extreme weather, are there community spaces to serve everyday needs? So for example, during a heat wave, is there a community space that's air conditioned? Or is there a space to go to get your information and news on what's happening outside of your home and the safety precautions that are necessary to take? In addition to this, upgrading community facilities. We know that outdoor recreation is essential to people, and so are there playgrounds, are there green spaces, are there community spaces and picnic tables and areas to congregate and socialize with your neighbors? That's all really beneficial for mental and physical health. Additionally, the addressing of ill repair, so the peeling lead paint and the mold and the rotting in the floors and ceilings, as well as failing HVAC systems. So are all of these things up to date? Is the paint fresh and lead free? Has mold been taken care of? And then additionally, a final one here is social services. So thinking about what types of services could be connected to your home. The attached pre-K children's center was one that was brought up in a New York NYCHA public housing unit. And they're working to include factors like that so that you can drop off your child at daycare and then go to work and come home and your child is being taken care of in the same place. So all of those go towards just your overall health and well-being in your living situation. And our next one, Adrienne will be talking a bit about. I'll pass it over to her.
Thanks, Gwen. Yeah, the next pillar we're looking at here is decarbonization and efficiency gains looped in there. And so the goal for this pillar is to transition the federally funded public housing as swiftly and seamlessly as possible into highly energy efficient homes that can produce on-site or procure enough carbon-free renewable energy to meet the entire total energy consumption annually. And at the same time to upgrade and equip all that public housing with cutting edge materials, infrastructure, and all electronic appliances made in the US in order to improve the energy efficiency and water quality and the material living standards in that public housing. So that's the overall goal, and there are some metrics that are being used to measure how that would take place. But what I'd like us to do is to think about how does that actually get implemented and achieved? How do we reach those decarbonization and energy efficiency gains in a public housing apartment? So I'm going to pose that to you all in another thought exercise on the next slide. I'd like to ask you to think of an average apartment. So maybe your apartment, someone's apartment you've been to recently, not that recently, hopefully. But if you're picturing that layout, the different rooms, the bedroom, the kitchen, the bathroom, where are places that you could see decarbonization happening? Where are the areas that could reduce the carbon emissions from that part of the apartment? Maybe electrify something. Yeah, some gas stoves, so switching over electrification of stoves and ovens, seeing that in the chat. Other ideas for where decarbonization could happen? Other things in the kitchen or I'm seeing windows, so maybe more sealed windows. We heard a lot of windy windows from people earlier, so adding more sealing there. Solar panels for lighting. Yeah, so adding solar to your house, that's reducing the carbon emissions. Switching to heat pumps. Yeah, so the heating, that can be a big source of carbon emissions. So switching over there. Composting, reducing the carbon footprint of your waste. Better air and water temperature control for better energy efficiency and better insulation. Yeah, so insulation all around, keeping that heat from escaping or reducing the need to cool. More bigger windows for more heat and switch to LED lights. Yeah, some of those areas you can upgrade to reduce carbon emissions there. Great. Yeah, on-site power generation if possible. Yeah, so those solar panels, anything you can do to reduce what that carbon footprint would be of your house. Low flow water faucets, yeah, increasing the energy efficiency, reducing your water bills. All good ideas in there. If you have any other ideas, feel free to share, but I'm gonna ask the next question there. Where could living standards improve? Are there those some of the same areas? Maybe there's overlap. If you're thinking about the different parts of the apartment, what can make the living standards improve? Air quality. Yeah, improving the air quality, improving people's health. Stable heating and cooling, that's really important to having a comfortable space to live, not having it get too hot or too cold. So probably the window upgrades and the insulation and those things we talked about earlier with temperature, that would help. Getting rid of the mold and biotoxin issues, yes. Tying in with air quality and health. So making sure that it's a healthy space, a comfortable space. Switching out appliances that are functional and not outdated. Yes, that helps with a living standard, to have something that actually works. So switching out any of those appliances, maybe in the kitchen, there's a lot. Clean water. Yeah, that's a big one. That's being able to use your running water. Great. Thank you all for thinking through those. I think we came up with a lot. The next slide, we have a few examples. So this was, these examples were taken from actually Boston University, put together this technical report. And I think they made a really good point that the retrofits will really differ by the housing type, what the building is, and your climate zone, right? So different needs for different places. We thought of a lot of really good things that are important for here in Boston, but those probably won't apply other places. So it's important when we're thinking about these decarbonization and efficiency goals to identify where the big wins are, specifically per house, per building, per region. Yeah, to make sure that we can meet those overarching goals.
Thanks. And yeah, that was super informative. I feel like it's also really interesting to think about this because yeah, we're all sitting around at home a lot. So it's like if you are thinking about how we can think about decarbonization and efficiency, you know, there's so much you can see around your apartment that like could change to be more efficient. So that's cool.
Yeah, I've definitely noticed the wind coming through my window more than I would have before. So gives you something to think about.
All right, so the next pillar is good jobs. And I think what I'm generally going to do in talking about this topic is talking about, you know, some of the structures that enable that. So this bill calls for the creation of a lot of jobs, but not only jobs, but union jobs. For those of you who are not familiar and understanding what a union is, it's really basically a group of workers that come together because they know that they have more power as together than each member would have on their own. So unions are typically organized by sector or employer, but in some cases, there are sort of these larger unions where you have different types of people who are in the same union or different types of workers that bargain separately for a contract. In unions, leaders are democratically elected, and unions can very much vary in scale from local or international. And they typically charge dues in order to keep up with basically the expenses of running it. And I think that when we think about unions, it's something that, I don't know, like I think that like the connotation is something that feels very far away to like a version of the past. But it's because, I mean, historically we've seen labor lose power by virtue of a lot of historic actions. And so as a result, when we're thinking about a new future that's decarbonized, where everyone has access to housing, we also want to think about a future where workers are empowered and workers are really a part of this fundamental project of providing everyone housing that's good and decarbonized. So one quote, which is from a Massachusetts union, is that unions don't just help union members, they're good for everyone. They put a floor under wages and benefits for entire industries, raising pay, making good benefits a key part of compensation, and improving conditions for all workers. So not only do unions provide, you know, a way for workers to collectively bargain, they set an industry standard for what workers should be paid. So that's the floor under wages and benefits. And when there are moments of crisis, unions can sort of step in and negotiate for these workers. I don't know if you all are familiar, but the sort of National Transit Workers Union has sort of, been like thinking really critically about this time during COVID and thinking about like how to negotiate that and negotiate when conditions transit workers should be allowed, given the fact that they're exposed to this pandemic nearly every day. So I think what unions do is that they provide this bargaining tool and they set industry standards. how does this relate to climate justice and labor? This is just an example from post-Katrina. This is the headline: the people who rebuilt New Orleans are still waiting to get paid, where there was issues with wages not properly being distributed to construction workers after Katrina and doing the reconstruction. So I think what's important, and also now that we're in a sort of crisis moment now, which is to say that like when we think about this connection between climate and labor, we oftentimes think about like, okay, like workers are the most vulnerable, they're the ones that are going to be impacted most, which is true. But also like these are the people that are going to be doing the work of recovery, of basically restoring, you know, certain services, of restoring areas. And if we think about hurricanes, floods, disasters, the people that need to do that restoration are workers, and therefore it's incredibly essential that they have good, safe, and like well-compensated jobs. And of course, the same forces of exploitation, extraction, and greed and profit are linked to the climate crisis as they are linked to the eroding power of labor, or the erosion of power. And yes, workers are amongst the most affected, but as I've noted, they're most essential to recovery. They are first effective and also have fewer resources, but simultaneously are relied upon, something that we can see in this crisis. And when we're thinking about green jobs and green work, something that I think has been sort of buzzy or like a popular term that has sort of been used when thinking about this in sort of the environmental field writ large, it's not just about decarbonization, it's also about the empowerment of the workers and the safety of those workers. And so there are opportunities sort of in this space. One is that I'm thinking about a just transition for fossil fuel workers, improving relatively poor conditions for those who are doing renewable energy work. A lot of jobs within the sort of like installation or solar installation are not union jobs and aren't compensated nearly as well. And also in this moment that we're in, union and worker power under COVID-19, and understanding that like people who are on the front lines, whether it's in a longer term future where we're sort of doing the work of building infrastructure, of building public housing, or if it's in the response now, that workers have power and are essential and therefore should be treated as such. And I'll turn it over to Adrienne to discuss how we will win.
Thanks, Saritha. I just wanted to pause because I think a question came in during the decarbonization section. I wanted to answer it quickly before we move on. So we see from Sue, these are good goals. There is some structure in the tax code to push for passive house standards and photovoltaic installations for low-income housing. What is the frequency you observe of these conservation and renewable measures actually being implemented? I guess from what I've seen some inspiring programs at the maybe more local level to get that implementation of solar. I just watched this documentary on Solar for All, the DC program installing PV around Washington, DC for lower income neighborhoods. So I have seen that. And I think what's really exciting about the Green New Deal for public housing is taking this opportunity at the federal level here to take the government owned public housing and set these standards and show that we can improve the standard of living and improve efficiency and reduce implement that decarbonization and set a good example for how it can be implemented more widely in private housing as well. Is there anything you'd add, Saritha or Gwen, for that?
That sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. Yeah, I think there are definitely state programs, local programs for implementing these type of improvements, especially for middle income and low income people. But yeah, the ability to do it on a federal scale is something that's really huge and really exciting. It's a great thing to highlight.
Yeah, great. Thank you for all your thoughtful questions so far. Please keep submitting them as we go. Okay, so we've made it to this question of we have these great goals, we have these bills here that are proposed that can get us there, set this really great example at the national level. How can we see this to the finish line? How can we get this implemented? So we have a strategy here. mobilize, partner, and co-sponsor. That's the three main pieces of our strategy. So if we want to mobilize for a complete economic and societal transformation here, we need to show that we know what a just transition can look like and what it can do to boost all aspects of life. Today, millions of people live in public housing buildings that are unsafe and have not been updated in decades. And it's time for our government to invest in our infrastructure, our most vulnerable communities, and our future. So we need to reinforce our partnerships with economic and racial justice groups and get as many representatives as possible to co-sponsor these bills. What can we do right now? Well, we have three key actions here that we think will start moving the dial in this direction. First, we'd like to call and email our representatives and senators about these bills, ask them to become co-sponsors. The second step, we'd like to promote these bills on social media so that your friends, your family, everyone you know can also call and email their representatives and senators, get them to be co-sponsors. And then we'd love to have anyone who's interested get involved with our team, with me, Saritha, Gwen, Jess, on the Sunrise Movement Boston partnerships team to solidify these partnerships and keep mobilizing around these needs. So I think we're ready for our next action, our next step. This one's pretty fun and makes it easy. You can use your phone. So if you take out your phone, should be able to, I dropped my phone here. Just navigate to that first link there, sunrisemovement.org/GND for public housing. If you do this on your phone, then all you have to do is submit your name, your contact info, and your zip code, and it will connect you right through to your representatives and your senators one by one. You just have to press a button in between and you'll get to talk to them. Yep, I will post that in the chat. Or can you, Saritha, can you click on it? I can, oh, you got it? Okay. Thank you. Make it easy. sunrisemovement.org/GND for public housing. Oops, might have gotten a little messed up there. Got it. Thank you, Sunrise Boston. Okay. Hopefully you can select that link, open it in your phone, have it up. Is that working? Put a plus sign if you're able to get through.
I've already visited this link. That's funny.
Oh, is that my problem? Okay, perfect. Guess you can't do it twice. Okay, so seems like people are getting to the link. So the next page, we've made it easier for you, hopefully, given you a few ideas and a sample script of how you can place these calls. Please feel free to go off script, say your own thing if you know what you want to say, but this has been really helpful for me when I called, to just start off by introducing yourself, your name, where you're calling from, making it clear why you're calling, to ask your representative to co-sponsor and vote yes on the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act and the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act. So that immediate response of rent and mortgage cancellation right now during the pandemic, and that long-term commitment to a Green New Deal for public housing. both of those pieces we can ask our representatives right now, and it will really be helpful talking with representatives. It's really nice to hear personally from folks what our stories are, how housing has impacted us, how we see housing being important in our lives, so that they can use that. So please, if you feel comfortable sharing your story with them, why these bills are important to you, that will help. And there are a few more details about those acts to back up any of that. But I think we'll give folks about 10 minutes to be able to navigate to that link, put in your information. You should get connected with your representatives, and then please put another plus sign in the chat when you're able to come back to the call here after talking with your rep.
Yeah, and as you'll see, it's like an automatic dialer, which when I first did it, I thought was like super cool. It's so much easier.
Yeah, makes it really nice. I'm always worried I'm calling the wrong place or something. So I think I'm going to use the second link that I had up there so that I can call again, because I didn't ask about the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act. So if people did already do that other one, I can paste that in the, in the link here.
There we go.
Yes, what Saritha just posted. If you already called about the Green New Deal for Public Housing Act, you're awesome, thank you. And please use that dialer that Saritha just shared. It's the short link right there with HR 6515, and can probably remind them about the Green New Deal for Public Housing at the same time. I think I'm gonna call about that. Then we'll check back in. I'll put my plus sign in too.
Yeah. Looks like we've got some pluses in the chat. Thanks so much.
That's awesome. Yeah, please share your pluses once you're done calling your rep. Hopefully you left some good messages. And also, it gave me the option to share Facebook and Twitter right after. So encourage you to take that second action to pass it on. Ask other folks to call their representatives. Let them know how easy it is with the cool automated calling if you do the manual entry of the address.
Oh, great. Love to see folks from the Markey campaign here. If you accidentally hung up, it's not a big deal. I think you can just call back again. It might take you to like the first representative because it'll like automatically dial all of your representatives. So I think you can just sort of click through or like go through that. I think that happened to me the first time.
Yeah, that happened to me the first time too, because I'm just used to hanging up after that. Used to hanging up after a call. Okay, do we have some plus signs for sharing the link as well? Are people getting through your calls? Yeah, thanks for doing it, Elena. Let us know here if you have questions, how it's working for you. Yes, add your plus once you're done with your call, your double plus once you've shared it. I'm still sharing mine, coming up with a good blurb here.
Yay, love to see plus signs.
Yeah, I know this is a little longer of an action, so thank you. Another plus. I'm gonna put my plus, have it out on Twitter and Facebook.
Oh, I keep sending to all panelists. Should be everyone. Everyone needs to know that I did this.
Yes.
Awesome.
Awesome. Yeah. All 3 calls. Love to see it. That's great. Another plus. Oop, we're getting a wave. Yeah, I think it's a little outdated. December 6th. That's great. I'm seeing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. At least 7 completed. Any shares? Another one. Nice. Up to 8.
Oh, the script. So all the slides are going to be made available afterwards. So I don't know if we can share them right now, but yeah, we can, once those are available, you can take that and share it with everyone you know.
Yeah, we kind of made a mashup of the script from both of those links that we shared, because one of them's for the Green New Deal for public housing, one of them's for the rent and mortgage cancellation. So if you share those links with people, they should have the scripts for both. Yeah, and we'll share it so that then you'll have your own mashup too.
Looks like we've got like 5 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we can wrap up this action then. Thank you everybody who was able to call, and hopefully folks were able to share some of those things too. It really makes a difference if we can share it with a few people and spread the word, really flood our representatives with these demands to make sure that especially the Rent and Mortgage Cancellation Act is included in the upcoming stimulus package, since that's coming right up, and that they remember we want this long-term action as well, not just something during the pandemic, but we need a Green New Deal for public housing for long term. So.
Oh, I think this was, yeah, an example.
Yeah, so hopefully folks were able to just share quickly from that link when you called. If not, you can select that link that was shared and share that from there. Awesome, some calls finished up. Thank you everybody for calling and for sharing these pieces too. We have some really cool artwork for the Green New Deal for public housing too. So if folks want to look at that and share some of those things, that's at the tiny URL at the bottom. It's a little hidden, but we'll send them out. And I think the next, so those were the first 2 steps, making the call and sharing the word on social media. And our third step we have is just thanking you, first of all, for being here with us, for talking through, engaging with us in this workshop. And if you're interested, please contact us. We have our email there, Sunrise Movement Boston Solidarity @gmail.com, and we'd love to hear your feedback on this workshop, and we'd love to hear if you're interested in the partnerships team learning more. Love to talk with you. Sarita, Gwen, anything to add?
I just posted some of those links in the chat, so please, we welcome feedback, and we also welcome you to join the partnerships team if interested. It was a lot of fun connecting with you virtually today, a little different, but I had a good time. And so again, we invite you to stay on because there's going to be the history of strikes and labor movements, followed by the big virtual rally with Ed Markey tonight.
Yes. Thank you, Gwen.
Yeah, thanks to everyone for joining us. We really appreciate it. And I think in doing this, the three of us have sort of learned a lot, and we hope that you learned something too. Definitely stay tuned for the next presentation. It's super related to this as well. Labor and strikes, I think, are also fundamentally related to housing. So if you're interested in it, definitely stay on. Also, I hear they have a really sick PowerPoint deck. It's very aesthetic and cool. So it's definitely an incentive. And also stay on for the rally at 7. And thanks again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.